The night stretched endlessly, black as tar, as Tyler gripped the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler. His rig, an old freightliner he'd affectionately named Big Betsy, rumbled along Route 87, a desolate stretch of highway notorious among truckers for its sinister reputation. Abandoned for decades after a massive pileup claimed dozens of lives, the road had reopened recently, promising a quicker route through the desert. Tyler, eager to shave off some hours and get his cargo to Los Angeles on time, ignored the whispered warnings he'd overheard at the last truck stop. Bad juju on that road, an old-timer had muttered, eyes darting nervously. Ghost rigs, lost souls, people vanish out there. Tyler had laughed it off. Superstitions were part of trucker folklore, stories to pass the time on long hauls. But now, as he plunged deeper into the desert night, a creeping unease settled over him. The CB radio, usually buzzing with chatter, was eerily silent. The headlights of Big Betsy carved out narrow tunnels of visibility, illuminating only the jagged edges of rocks and patches of scrub. Not a single other vehicle had passed him in hours. The first sign of trouble came in the form of lights in his rearview mirror. Distant but growing steadily closer, they swayed and bounced unnaturally, as if the vehicle behind him were riding uneven terrain. Tyler squinted, trying to make out the source, but the lights danced and shifted, almost playful in their elusiveness. Then came the sound, a low, guttural rumble, unlike any engine he'd ever heard. Frowning, he reached for the CB mic. Breaker, breaker. Anyone on Route 87 tonight? Got a rig tailing me with some weird lights. You seeing this? Static hissed back at him. He flipped channels, tried again. Still nothing. The lights drew nearer, and Tyler felt the vibration of another truck's engine reverberate through Big Betsy's cabin. He glanced in his side mirror. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The rig behind him wasn't like any truck he'd ever seen. Its headlights were too bright, almost blinding, and the truck itself shimmered with an otherworldly glow. It appeared battered, rusted, with jagged holes punched through its trailer. Smoke, or was it fog, billowed around its wheels, which didn't seem to touch the asphalt. Instead, they hovered just above it. Tyler's instincts screamed at him to speed up, but when he pressed his foot to the gas pedal, Big Betsy groaned in protest. The speedometer refused to climb. He was stuck at a steady 55 miles per hour, no matter how hard he pushed. A horn blared, deep and mournful, like the cry of a dying animal. Tyler clutched the wheel tighter, heart pounding. The ghost rig pulled up alongside him, its cab impossibly high. In the driver's seat sat a figure cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. But the eyes, two pinpricks of crimson light, pierced through the darkness and locked onto Tyler. The radio crackled to life. You shouldn't be here. A voice growled, guttural and distorted. It didn't sound human. Tyler swerved, desperate to put distance between him and the phantom truck, but the road narrowed, hemmed in by steep cliffs. He was trapped. The ghost rig surged ahead, cutting him off, and for a moment Tyler thought it was over. He braced for impact. But instead of colliding, the spectral truck veered into the rocky embankment and vanished. Breathing hard, Tyler scanned the road ahead. It was empty again, as if the ghostly encounter had never happened. But his relief was short-lived. The CB radio crackled once more, this time with a different voice, a woman's, soft and sorrowful. "Help me," it whispered. "Please. He won't let me go." "Who's there?" Tyler stammered. "What's going on?" A cold wind whipped through the cab, though the windows were closed. The temperature plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of the windshield. Then he saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, her white dress billowing as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror. Tyler slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as Big Betsy skidded to a halt just inches from her. He jumped down from the cab, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She pointed past him, her hand trembling. Tyler turned and saw, to his horror, that the ghost rig had returned. It loomed behind Big Betsy, its headlights now dark, its form barely visible in the dim light. But the figure in the driver's seat was unmistakable. The crimson eyes burned brighter, and the ghost rig's engine roared to life. The woman screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that made Tyler's ears ring. Before he could react, she was pulled backward as if by invisible hands and vanished into the rig's cab. The truck surged forward, barreling toward Tyler. He dove out of the way, landing hard on the gravel shoulder. Big Betsy shook violently as the ghost rig passed through it like a specter. Tyler scrambled to his feet, his heart racing, and clambered back into the cab. He didn't look back as he floored the gas. Big Betsy roared to life, the speedometer finally climbing. The haunted stretch of Route 87 blurred past him, and he didn't stop until the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. At the next truck stop, Tyler stumbled into the diner, his face pale and his hands trembling. He tried to tell the other truckers what had happened, but their expressions told him they'd heard it all before. "You're lucky you made it out," one of them said, his voice low. "Not everyone does. That road's cursed, you know. They say it's where lost souls go when they've got nowhere else. Ghost rigs, hitchhikers who aren't really there." He shook his head. "Best stick to the main highways from now on." Tyler nodded numbly, swearing to himself that he'd never take a shortcut again. But as he climbed back into Big Betsy, he noticed something in the passenger seat. A single white rose, fresh and dewy, with petals as cold as ice.
Story number 2.
The night sky was heavy with clouds, a black void that devoured the moonlight as Dale guided his semi down the infamous stretch of Old Hollow Road. It was a shortcut only the most desperate or foolish truckers used. A desolate ribbon of cracked asphalt weaving through the woods, marked by eerie tales and unexplained disappearances. Dale didn't believe in ghost stories, but the prospect of cutting 3 hours off his route to deliver a late-night haul was too tempting to pass up. The first half hour was uneventful. The only sounds were the low hum of his engine and the occasional groan of the trailer behind him. His headlights illuminated the skeletal branches of leafless trees, clawing at the road like gnarled fingers. Despite the isolation, Dale couldn't shake the sensation that he wasn't alone. The unease began with a subtle shift in the air. The temperature inside the cab plummeted, frost blooming along the edges of the windshield. Dale frowned and cranked the heat, but the cold persisted, biting through his jacket. The radio, which had been playing static-filled country music, abruptly cut out. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a sound, a long, mournful howl that echoed like a lament for the dead. "Coyotes!" Dale muttered, though his voice trembled. He tightened his grip on the wheel and pressed on. The headlights caught movement up ahead, a figure standing in the center of the road. Dale's heart lurched as he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. The semi shuddered to a stop, mere feet from the figure, a woman dressed in a tattered black dress. Her hair hung in wet, matted strands around her face, and her eyes, they were lifeless, empty voids that reflected nothing. Dale honked the horn, hoping she'd move, but she didn't flinch. "Lady, get out of the road," he yelled, leaning out the window. She raised an arm, pointing behind him, slowly, unnaturally. A chill slithered down Dale's spine. Against his better judgment, he turned his head to look in the side mirror. At first, he saw nothing but the dark road stretching behind him. Then, something shifted. A shadow detached itself from the trees, growing larger as it moved closer. Dale blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. It wasn't. The shadow had a shape, twisted and unnatural, like a grotesque fusion of a man and a beast. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and spasmodic, as though it was unused to walking. And its face, Dale's breath caught. It didn't have a face, just a black void where one should be, framed by writhing tendrils of smoke. The shadow lunged forward, impossibly fast. Panicked, Dale yanked the wheel and stomped on the gas, swerving around the woman in the road. His semi roared as it barreled down the asphalt, the engine screaming in protest. The shadow gave chase. Dale risked a glance in the rearview mirror. It was there, keeping pace with the truck, its grotesque limbs skittering like a spider's. The trailer rattled violently as the thing slammed into it, leaving deep, jagged dents. The CB radio crackled to life, spewing static and garbled voices. "Turn around," a voice hissed, barely audible beneath the noise. "You're not supposed to be here." "I'm getting the hell out of here," Dale shouted, his voice breaking. The road ahead began to change. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, revealing blackened soil. The trees on either side grew denser, their branches intertwining to form a tunnel of darkness. The headlights flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced like wraiths. Dale's heart raced as the shadow thing climbed onto the trailer, its clawed hands gouging through the metal. He could feel the weight of it, the way the semi groaned under its unnatural burden. The cab filled with the stench of sulfur and decay. Then, out of nowhere, he saw it. A bridge spanning a deep, jagged ravine. The bridge wasn't on his map, and its rickety wooden planks looked far from sturdy. But it was his only way forward. As Dale sped toward the bridge, the creature let out a piercing shriek that reverberated in his skull. It leapt from the trailer, landing on the hood of the semi. Its clawed hands smashed into the windshield, cracking the glass as it stared at him with that featureless void of a face. With a roar, Dale jerked the wheel, sending the semi careening onto the bridge. The wooden planks groaned and splintered beneath the weight, but he didn't slow down. The creature clawed at the windshield, its tendrils snaking through the cracks, reaching for him. Suddenly, the bridge gave way. The semi lurched, the trailer tipping into the abyss. Dale screamed as the cab tilted forward, teetering on the edge. In a desperate move, he unbuckled his seatbelt and kicked the door open, throwing himself onto the bridge just as the semi plunged into the darkness below. The last thing he saw before blacking out was the shadow creature, clinging to the falling truck, its shriek echoing into oblivion. Dale woke up hours later, sprawled on the side of the road. The bridge was gone, replaced by an unbroken stretch of highway. His semi, his trailer, and the shadow creature were nowhere to be seen. When he reached the nearest town and recounted his story, the locals shook their heads. "Old Hollow Road's a death trap," one of them said. "Nobody's supposed to survive it. Count yourself lucky, driver. Most don't make it back." But Dale didn't feel lucky. The memory of those lifeless eyes and the void-faced creature haunted him, a reminder that some shortcuts are better left untraveled.
Story number 3.
Jacob Fisher had been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, and he prided himself on being unshakable. Midnight runs, treacherous mountain passes, white-knuckle storms, none of it fazed him. But the stretch of Blackridge Pass he was about to traverse had a reputation that even seasoned truckers avoided. Stories abounded: ghost sightings, phantom hitchhikers, and trucks that disappeared without a trace. The road itself was a relic from a time before modern highways, a narrow, winding path carved into the side of a mountain. But Jacob was on a tight schedule, and the detour through Blackridge would save him hours. The first 2 hours were uneventful. His rig's headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the jagged cliffs and sharp turns. He kept his radio tuned to the Weather Channel for company, though the monotone drone of forecasts offered little comfort. It was during one of the sharper curves that he noticed the first sign of trouble: a rusted-out, abandoned truck lying half-submerged in a ditch. Its cab was crushed, its windshield shattered. There were no signs of a driver or cargo. Jacob slowed, the sight gnawing at his nerves, but he pressed on. About 20 minutes later, the fog rolled in. Thick and white, it swallowed the road in an instant, forcing Jacob to slow to a crawl. The headlights were nearly useless, their beams reflecting back at him like a wall of light. That's when he heard it. The faint sound of a horn, long and mournful, echoing from somewhere ahead. Jacob leaned forward, straining to see through the fog. The sound came again, closer this time. He rounded a bend and slammed on the brakes. In the middle of the road was an old tanker truck, its chrome reflecting the dim glow of his headlights. The tanker's cab was pristine, gleaming as if it had just rolled off the assembly line, but its trailer was covered in rust, riddled with holes and leaking a dark, viscous liquid onto the asphalt. Jacob honked his horn. "Move it," he muttered, though he doubted anyone was inside. The tanker didn't budge. Frustrated, Jacob flipped on his hazards, climbed down from his cab, and approached the tanker. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and something else, something acrid and sour, like rotting meat. As he got closer, he noticed something odd. The cab's door was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if someone had just climbed out. The inside was spotless, the seats still covered in plastic, but there were no keys in the ignition and no signs of a driver. Jacob turned to head back to his rig when he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the fog, just beyond the reach of the tanker's trailer. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. The figure took a step closer, its form half dissolving into the mist, and Jacob realized with a jolt of terror that it wasn't walking, it was gliding. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice trembling. "You need help?" The figure stopped, its head tilted unnaturally to one side as if studying him. Then it raised an arm, long and skeletal, and pointed behind him. Jacob turned. His truck was gone. Panic surged through him as he stumbled back toward where his rig had been parked. The fog seemed thicker now, choking and clinging to his skin like a living thing. He tripped over something solid and cold, sprawling onto the asphalt. It was the front grille of his truck, separated from the cab, lying in a pool of dark liquid. "Impossible," he whispered, scrambling to his feet. His truck had been whole minutes ago. The fog began to churn, swirling around him like a storm. The tanker truck vanished into the mist, leaving Jacob standing alone on the road. Then the sound came again, a deep, resonant horn vibrating through the air. Jacob turned in every direction, searching for its source. And then he saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the fog, surrounding him. They were too far away to make out the forms they belonged to, but he could feel their weight, their malice. The horn sounded once more, deafeningly close, and the fog began to close in. He ran. Jacob didn't know where he was going. He only knew he needed to get away. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and turning as if it had no beginning or end. The fog pressed closer, carrying whispers now, words he couldn't quite understand, but that filled him with dread. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they weren't whispers anymore, but screams. When Jacob finally saw light ahead, his chest ached with relief. He burst out of the fog, stumbling into the parking lot of a tiny gas station. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stared at him as he collapsed onto the counter, gasping for breath. "Blackridge?" she asked knowingly. Jacob nodded, trembling. "You're lucky you made it out," she said. "Most don't." When he turned to look back at the road, the fog was gone. But in the far distance, at the edge of the horizon, he swore he saw those glowing eyes watching him, waiting for the next unlucky soul to take the shortcut.
Story number 4.
The moon hung low, swollen and red, casting an ominous glow over the narrow highway as Joe Riggins drove his big rig through the heart of Appalachia. The route wasn't on any map. He'd found it by chance after a GPS malfunction. A shortcut, he'd muttered to himself, desperate to make his delivery on time. The road was strange from the start. It twisted unnaturally, almost serpentine, and the dense forest on either side seemed to press in closer with every mile. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches forming eerie silhouettes against the crimson sky. Joe tried to shake off the creeping unease, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then the sign appeared. It was old, nearly falling apart, its paint faded and peeling. The words "Sorrow's End, 15 miles" were barely legible. He frowned. He hadn't seen anything about a town on the GPS earlier, but maybe this route wasn't entirely abandoned. The further he drove, the darker it became. The headlights seemed to dim, swallowed by the oppressive shadows. Joe noticed something odd. The odometer hadn't changed in nearly 10 minutes. It stayed frozen, the numbers unmoving, as though the truck was standing still despite the steady hum of the engine. Then came the first noise. It was faint at first, a low scraping sound, like metal dragging against asphalt. Joe dismissed it as his imagination, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. He glanced at his side mirror and froze. Something was following him. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but the figure was human-shaped, crouched low to the ground. Its arms were unnaturally long, the fingertips dragging along the road, creating the metallic screech. Its head hung at an odd angle, as though its neck had been broken. Joe's stomach turned, but he refused to stop. "Just a trick of the shadows," he muttered. He pressed harder on the gas. The thing matched his speed. It ran now, loping on all fours like a wild animal, its limbs jerking in unnatural directions. The screeching sound intensified, and Joe's heart pounded as the thing veered closer, its head snapping upward. Two hollow, glowing eyes locked onto his cab. Joe grabbed the CB mic, his voice trembling. "Breaker! Breaker! Anyone out there? I need help! Something's on me!" The radio crackled to life. "Don't stop," a voice replied, rough and panicked. "Whatever you do, keep driving. Don't look back." Joe's blood ran cold. "Who is this? What the hell is going on?" he yelled into the mic. The voice didn't respond. Instead, the CB emitted a deep, rhythmic thumping sound, like a heartbeat. Joe's hands shook as he threw the mic aside. The road ahead began to change. The asphalt cracked and split, revealing jagged edges and holes that seemed to breathe, exhaling plumes of mist. The trees on either side twisted unnaturally, their branches curling like claws. And then he saw them. Figures stood at the edges of the road. Dozens of them, their forms shrouded in mist. They were still at first, but as Joe's truck passed, their heads snapped toward him in unison. Their faces were voids, empty spaces where features should have been. The whispers started next. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language Joe didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Accusatory. Angry. The figure chasing him suddenly appeared beside the cab, slamming into the door. Joe screamed, swerving violently to shake it off. The truck roared as it barreled down the treacherous road, the tires skidding dangerously close to the crumbling edges. He risked a glance at the passenger window. The thing was clinging to the side of the truck now, its bony fingers digging into the metal. Its face was pressed against the glass, its empty eyes boring into his. Slowly, it opened its mouth, an impossibly wide, gaping void, and began to scream. The sound wasn't human. It was a cacophony of agony, a chorus of countless voices wailing in unison. Joe's vision blurred as pain lanced through his skull. In desperation, he slammed on the brakes. The figure was thrown forward, tumbling onto the cracked asphalt. Joe didn't wait to see what happened next. He floored the gas, the truck lurching forward as the wheels screeched. The road began to stretch unnaturally, elongating into an endless tunnel of darkness. Joe's headlights flickered, threatening to go out. The whispers were deafening now, joined by the faint sound of a woman sobbing. "Help me." The voice was soft, fragile, coming from the sleeper cab behind him. Joe's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't picked up anyone. He knew the sleeper was empty. "Help me," the voice repeated, closer this time. He didn't dare turn around. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by cold, cruel laughter. Suddenly, the truck bucked violently, as if something massive had landed on the roof. Joe screamed, gripping the wheel as the entire rig shuddered. A hand, pale and skeletal, slammed against the windshield, followed by another. The figure from before crawled over the hood, its empty eyes glowing with malevolent glee. Joe's mind raced. He had to end this. Ahead, the road abruptly ended, giving way to a massive cliff. Without thinking, Joe pressed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as the truck hurtled toward the edge. The creature's eyes widened, and for the first time, it recoiled. Joe screamed as the truck launched into the void, the cab plummeting through the air. The last thing he saw was the moon, red and terrible, watching as he fell. When Joe woke up, he was lying on the side of the highway. His truck was gone. The road was pristine, no cracks, no mist, just an empty stretch of asphalt under a pale dawn sky. He never found his rig, and he never took another shortcut again. But sometimes on quiet nights, he hears whispers in the wind calling his name, beckoning him back to sorrow's end.
Story number 5.
Terry Malone didn't scare easily. 20 years behind the wheel of his semi had shown him just about everything. Violent storms, dangerous mountain passes, even a standoff with a would-be hijacker. But nothing in his experience prepared him for the stretch of road called Devil's Divide. The name was infamous among truckers. It was said to be cursed, a place where reality warped and time unraveled. Terry didn't believe in curses, but he couldn't deny the road's reputation. Truckers who ventured down Devil's Divide often didn't come back. Those who did were never the same. It was close to midnight when Terry found himself at the divide's entrance. A delivery delay had forced him to reroute, and the divide was the only way to make up the lost time. He hesitated, his hand gripping the steering wheel tightly. The GPS showed a smooth line through the dense forest. No warnings, no alternative routes. Just stories, Terry muttered. Ghost stories for rookies. The road was narrow and cloaked in shadows. Massive trees lined both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the moonlight struggled to penetrate. His high beams cast eerie shapes that flickered and moved in the periphery of his vision. The first sign of trouble came as a shadow darted across the road. It was quick, too quick to identify, a blur of darkness that vanished before he could register what it was. Terry slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching. The truck lurched to a stop. He scanned the road ahead, heart pounding. There was nothing there. No animal, no shadow. Just a deer, he said aloud, trying to convince himself. He started the truck again, but the air inside the cab felt heavier, colder. The smell of burning rubber wafted in, though his tires were fine. Uneasy, he reached for the radio. "Breaker, breaker," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Anybody out there?" Static crackled. Then, faintly, a voice responded. "Turn back." Terry frowned, pressing the button. "Who's this? I got a tight schedule and no time for jokes." The voice returned, louder this time. "Turn back. It's too late for me, but you still have a chance." Chills ran down his spine. Before he could respond, the radio fell silent. The road ahead stretched into the darkness, and Terry had no choice but to press on. But now his confidence wavered. The forest seemed alive, the trees twisting and writhing as though trying to block his path. The shadows that darted across the road became more frequent, some of them human-shaped, some not. And then he saw the lights. 2 bright orbs appeared in his rearview mirror, growing closer at an unnatural speed. They looked like headlights, but there was no accompanying sound of an engine, no shape of a vehicle. Just those lights, cold and piercing, bearing down on him. Terry floored the gas. The semi roared as it surged forward, but the lights kept pace, weaving unnaturally from side to side. He glanced in the mirror again, and his stomach dropped. The lights weren't headlights at all. They were eyes. A figure emerged from the darkness behind him, its body barely discernible, but its eyes glowing like molten metal. It moved with terrifying speed, its limbs contorted and unnaturally long. Terry's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as he tore around a sharp curve, his trailer swaying dangerously. The thing followed, its glowing eyes never leaving him. Suddenly, the cab's interior lights flickered and the air turned freezing cold. A voice, guttural and inhuman, echoed through the radio. "You can't outrun me, Terry." His name. How did it know his name? Panic surged through him as the road began to change. The asphalt cracked, revealing black veins that pulsed like living things. The trees bent toward the truck, their branches scratching at the trailer like claws. Ahead, a figure stood in the middle of the road. Terry barely had time to react. He yanked the wheel, swerving around it, but not before catching a glimpse. A gaunt face, hollow eyes, and a mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. The truck veered off the road, skidding into a clearing. Terry slammed on the brakes, the semi screeching to a halt inches from a tree. The engine sputtered and died. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the laughter began. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that didn't belong to any living thing. Terry scrambled for the door, throwing it open and stumbling onto the cold, damp ground. The laughter grew louder, closer. He turned toward the truck and froze. The glowing-eyed figure stood atop the cab, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It grinned down at him, its teeth too sharp, too numerous. "You should have turned back," it hissed. Terry ran. He plunged into the forest, the branches tearing at his clothes and skin. The laughter followed, along with the sound of heavy, wet footsteps. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't stop until he saw it. A faint light in the distance. A highway patrol car. He burst onto the main road, waving his arms frantically. The officer stepped out, his face etched with confusion. "Sir, are you all right?" Terry collapsed at the man's feet, gasping. When he turned to point back at the forest, the road was empty. No truck, no figure, no glowing eyes. "They took my truck," he stammered. The officer's expression darkened. "You came from Devil's Divide, didn't you?" Terry nodded weakly. "You're lucky you made it out," the officer said, glancing uneasily at the dark forest. "Most don't." Terry never found his truck, and he never spoke of what he saw again. But years later, on quiet nights, he swore he could still hear the laughter echoing faintly through the trees.
Story number 6.
Earl Haskins was used to solitude. Long-haul trucking was a lonely profession, and Earl thrived on the quiet. But even he felt a pang of unease as he rolled onto Dead Men's Hollow, a forgotten stretch of road cutting through the heart of the Nevada desert. The road wasn't marked on any map he'd ever seen, but his dispatcher had sworn it was a shortcut. "Shave an hour off your trip," the guy had promised. Earl was behind schedule and figured he'd give it a shot. The first hour was uneventful, the highway straight as an arrow, flanked by endless sands. The sky was clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Earl relaxed, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel as classic rock crackled through the radio. Then the headlights appeared. At first, they were distant, just a faint glimmer on the horizon. Earl figured it was another trucker, maybe some company for the lonely road. But as he watched, the lights grew brighter, too bright. They weren't just approaching, they were hurtling toward him at an impossible speed. "Easy there, buddy," Earl muttered, gripping the wheel as the oncoming vehicle showed no sign of slowing. The lights bore down on him, blindingly white. At the last second, Earl swerved, his rig skidding onto the shoulder. The roar of an engine passed, deafening, and then nothing. Earl blinked, his heart pounding. He looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the other vehicle's taillights receding into the distance. There was nothing there. The road behind him was empty. He shook his head, laughing nervously. "Desert plays tricks on you, Earl. Don't go losing it now." But as the miles ticked by, the strange occurrences piled up. The radio crackled, switching stations on its own. Static gave way to voices, low, murmuring voices speaking in a language Earl didn't recognize. The temperature in the cab plummeted, and no matter how high he cranked the heater, the cold seeped into his bones. Then came the hitchhiker. Earl spotted him up ahead, standing by the side of the road. A young man in a tattered jacket, his thumbs stuck out. Earl wasn't one to pick up strangers, but something about the man's face, pale and drawn, gnawed at him. He slowed the truck, leaning out the window. "You need a ride?" The man nodded, climbing into the cab without a word. Earl noticed his hands were trembling. "Where are you headed?" Earl asked, trying to keep his voice light. Just down the road, the hitchhiker replied, his voice hoarse. Thanks for stopping. Most folks don't. Earl frowned. Not many people out here to stop, son. What's your story? The hitchhiker didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his gaze fixed on the dark road. Minutes passed in silence, and Earl began to regret his decision. There was something off about the man, his stillness, the way his breath fogged up the window despite the cold. Mind if I turn the heat up? Earl asked. No need, the hitchhiker said softly. We're almost there. Earl glanced at him. Almost where? The hitchhiker turned, and Earl's stomach dropped. The man's eyes were gone. Empty sockets stared back at him, black and endless. Earl slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. When he turned, the hitchhiker was gone. The passenger door hung open, swinging gently in the wind. Shaken, Earl climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The desert was silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. He circled the truck, searching for any sign of the hitchhiker, but there was nothing, just his rig and the endless highway. As he climbed back into the cab, he froze. Words were scrawled across the windshield in frost, letters jagged and uneven. Turn back. Earl didn't need to be told twice. He fired up the engine and threw the truck into gear, his hands trembling on the wheel. The road stretched endlessly before him, but the darkness seemed deeper now, alive with shadows that moved just beyond the reach of his headlights. Then the laughter began. It started as a low chuckle, faint and distant, but it grew louder, filling the cab with a cacophony of voices, mocking, cruel, and inhuman. Earl's grip tightened as he floored the gas, the truck roaring down the desolate road. But no matter how far he drove, the laughter followed. And then he saw it, a massive black shape in the middle of the highway. It towered over the road, its outline jagged and wrong, like something half-formed. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed a sickly yellow, fixing on Earl's truck as he hurtled toward it. He had no time to stop. The rig slammed into the shape and everything went black. When Earl woke up, he was sitting in his cab, parked at the edge of Deadman's Hollow. The truck was undamaged, his cargo intact. The road ahead was clear, the desert bathed in soft dawn light. But Earl didn't feel relief. His radio was still crackling, the static interspersed with faint laughter. And in the rearview mirror, he saw them, shadowy figures standing at the edge of the road, their eyeless faces turned toward him. He didn't take shortcuts anymore.
Story number 7.
Late at night, deep in the heart of the American Midwest, there exists a web of forgotten highways, a tangle of asphalt veins that no longer pulse with the lifeblood of traffic. These are roads that time has abandoned, where faded signs point to towns that don't exist anymore, and where truckers dare not venture unless they have no other choice. The stories that emerge from these desolate stretches are not the kind to be shared lightly. They're whispered at truck stops over weak coffee, the tales of men and women who've seen the unimaginable. One such tale begins with a man named Hank, a veteran trucker with 30 years of highway experience. Hank had always laughed at the ghost stories other drivers swapped. To him, they were nothing more than caffeine-fueled fantasies meant to keep drivers awake during the long hauls. But one night, he found himself driving along a road he didn't recognize. His GPS had glitched, rerouting him through what appeared to be an unmarked highway. The asphalt was cracked, and weeds crept through the fissures. His headlights barely pierced the inky blackness ahead. As he drove, Hank noticed the eerie silence. Usually, even the most remote roads had the occasional sound of crickets or the distant howl of a coyote. But here, there was nothing. Just the hum of his engine and the faint static of the CB radio. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught movement. It was a man standing on the side of the road, waving for help. Hank slowed, squinting to make out the figure. The man looked gaunt, his clothes tattered, as though he'd been wandering for weeks. Against his better judgment, Hank pulled over. As the man approached, something felt off. His eyes glinted unnaturally in the beam of the headlights, and his movements were jerky, almost mechanical. Hank rolled down his window just enough to hear him. "Can you take me to the next town?" the man asked, his voice a hollow echo. Hank hesitated, but the desperation in the man's tone compelled him to nod. He unlocked the passenger door. The man climbed in, and that's when Hank noticed the smell, a sickly sweet odor, like rotting fruit mixed with gasoline. He tried to ignore it and focused on the road. "What's your name?" Hank asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned to look at Hank, his face now illuminated by the dashboard lights. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty sockets. Hank slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. But when he turned to confront the man, the passenger seat was empty. Panicked, Hank floored the gas, desperate to escape. The radio crackled to life, static hissing before a distorted voice whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." The headlights flickered, and for a brief moment the road ahead was filled with shadowy figures, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. They reached for the truck, their hands scraping against the metal with a sound that sent shivers down Hank's spine. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The road was empty again, the figures gone. Hank didn't stop until he reached a well-lit truck stop miles away. Shaking, he stepped out of his cab and lit a cigarette, his hands trembling. Other drivers noticed his pale face and approached. When he told them what had happened, one of the older truckers nodded grimly. "You were on Route 61, the man said. "That road's been closed for years. They say it's cursed, that anyone who drives it sees the souls of those who died there, truckers who never made it out." Hank didn't reply. He finished his cigarette in silence, vowing never to drive an unfamiliar road again. To this day, Hank swears the story is true. And if you ever find yourself on an abandoned highway with no cell service and a strange man waving you down, think twice before you stop. Some roads are best left forgotten, and some passengers are better left behind.
Story number 8.
The trucker known as Big Ray had seen his share of strange things on the road. 30 years behind the wheel gave you plenty of time to encounter the unexplainable. But there was one story Ray never shared unless pressed, one that still kept him awake on long, lonely nights. It was just past midnight, and Ray was hauling a load of steel across a remote stretch of Wyoming highway. The stars overhead were cold and distant, the only company for miles around. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. The CB radio was quiet, except for the occasional crackle of static. As Ray rounded a bend, his headlights caught something in the distance, a pair of faint red lights hovering low to the ground. At first, he thought it was another truck, maybe pulled over with its hazard lights on. But as he approached, the lights didn't grow closer. They stayed the same distance away, always just out of reach. Ray grumbled to himself, gripping the wheel tighter. "Must be a reflection," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. The red lights were too steady, too deliberate. Then his radio buzzed, and a voice broke through the static, low and distorted. "Turn back, Ray. Turn back before it's too late." Ray froze, his knuckles white on the wheel. He hadn't told anyone he was on this route. His blood ran cold. "Who is this?" He barked into the CB, his voice steadier than he felt. But there was no response, only the hum of static. Moments later, a figure appeared in the road ahead. A woman standing in the middle of the lane, her hair wild and matted. She wore a tattered white dress, and her face was obscured in shadow. Ray slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just feet away from her. He leaned out the window, heart pounding. "You okay, lady? Need a ride?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed down the road, her arm trembling. Ray hesitated, but nodded. He inched the truck forward, keeping an eye on her in the rearview mirror. But the moment he passed, she vanished, gone as if she'd never been there. The red lights appeared again, closer this time, and moving. They weaved back and forth across the road like eyes watching him. A chill ran down Ray's spine as the air in the cab grew colder. His breath fogged the windshield. Then the whispers started. Faint at first, like wind through cracked glass, but they grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. They spoke his name, begging, crying, warning him to stop. Ray's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel tighter. "It's just your mind playing tricks," he whispered to himself, though deep down he knew better. Ahead, the red lights merged into a single massive glow, taking the shape of a burning semi-truck. Flames licked the edges of the cab, and the heat radiated through Ray's windshield. A driver sat behind the wheel, his face charred and unrecognizable, but his hollow eyes locked onto Ray's. "Turn back," the man mouthed, though no sound came. Ray swerved, narrowly avoiding the apparition as his truck barreled off the road. When he stopped, his heart was hammering in his chest. He stumbled out of the cab, gasping for air. The highway was empty. No fire, no wreckage, no red lights, just the endless expanse of asphalt stretching into the night. The next day, when Ray finally made it to the truck stop, he asked the locals about the road. Their faces darkened, and an old-timer shook his head. That's the Devil's Mile, the man said. Truckers have been disappearing there for decades. They say a rig burned up out there years ago, driver and all. Now his ghost haunts the road, trying to warn others before it's too late. Ray didn't sleep for days after that. And though he still drives the highways, he refuses to set foot anywhere near Wyoming's forgotten roads. Because some stretches of asphalt aren't just lonely, they're hungry.